Boston, October 2010. The kind of autumn that turns sidewalks into paths of amber and gold had just begun to settle over the quiet suburbs of Brookline, where Michael Davenport, a 26-year-old literature graduate, stood alone in his late grandfather's study. An old room lined with shelves of worn books, dusted memories, and the quiet air of a life that had long since begun to fade. The house had not changed since his childhood. The ticking of the wall clock, the faint scent of pipe tobacco soaked into the leather armchair, and the cold hush that filled the space when no one else was around. His grandfather, Richard Davenport, had died the week before at the age of 91, a veteran, a schoolteacher, a man of few words and fewer explanations. He had been kind, but private, so private, in fact, that when the will instructed Michael to sort through his personal effects with care and curiosity, it felt less like a formality and more like a final invitation to understand the man he had barely known. The boxes were labeled with dates and initials, old notebooks stacked beside army insignia, service medals tucked into velvet, and family photographs that had begun to curl at the edges. Michael moved through them slowly, methodically, not expecting much, until he found a small, leather-bound book wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief and placed alone in a wooden drawer. The cover was cracked and soft to the touch, the binding barely holding, and as he opened it, the pages gave off the unmistakable scent of time, that mix of paper, dust, and the faint warmth of a human hand that had held it decades before. Between two pages, somewhere in the middle, around a line from Emerson's essays, something slipped loose. A folded piece of paper, delicate and browned with age, fluttered onto the desk in front of him. Michael froze. It was a letter, handwritten. The date was unmistakable, June 1944, and the signature at the bottom, though faded, was still legible. Lieutenant Jonathan Hale, U.S. Army, 45th Infantry Division. The letter was addressed to someone named Margaret. Michael's heart stopped for a moment, not because the letter was old, but because Margaret was the name of his grandmother, who had never once mentioned a man named Jonathan Hale, not to him, not to anyone. He turned back to the first page of the book and noticed for the first time a handwritten dedication just above the title. To Margaret, who taught me that war may wound the body but not the soul. It was the same handwriting, the same hand that had written the letter. And suddenly, the room felt different, not just filled with books and memories, but with silence, a purposeful silence, one that had waited for decades to be broken. And Michael knew, deep in his bones, that this wasn't just a forgotten note between old lovers. This was a history rewritten, a truth hidden. A life paused and left unspoken, and he was the one meant to open the pages again. If this story moves you as deeply as it moved me writing it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, surprise, and stay with you. And now, take a breath, because what happens next will change everything. The morning after Michael discovered the letter, sunlight poured softly through the kitchen windows of his childhood home, where the air still smelled faintly of toasted rye bread and old wood. He sat at the table in silence, the worn leather book resting before him like an artifact, and beside it, sealed in a clear archival sleeve, the letter that had shaken something loose inside him. Sleep had not come easily. His mind had raced all night with possibilities, half-formed questions, and a growing sense of obligation, not to explain, but to understand. Who was Jonathan Hale? How did his letter end up hidden inside a book that had belonged to Michael's grandfather? And more importantly, why had no one ever spoken his name? His mother entered the room, still in her robe, clutching a mug of coffee. She paused when she saw the objects laid out on the table, her eyes narrowing not with suspicion, but with something closer to recognition, a flicker of memory. "I found this in Grandpa's desk," Michael said quietly, sliding the letter toward her. "Do you know who Jonathan Hale was?" She took the page slowly, scanning it with practiced eyes. And then, with a voice barely louder than the sound of her breath, She said, "That name. It's familiar. I think Grandma might have mentioned him once. Maybe. A long time ago." She paused again, then added, "But your grandfather, he never talked about the war, ever, and definitely not about anything before your grandmother." Michael pointed to the first page of the book. "Look," he said, flipping it open. "There's a dedication to her in his handwriting, same as the letter." She leaned in, tracing her finger over the words. "To Margaret, who taught me that war may wound the body, but not the soul." She didn't speak for a while. Then, "I think this was hers, something she kept, and he kept it for her." That afternoon, driven by something deeper than curiosity, maybe grief, maybe awe, Michael dove headfirst into research. He scoured military databases, veteran forums, old newspaper archives. The 45th Infantry Division, he discovered, had fought through Italy in 1944, including the brutal campaigns near Monte Cassino and Anzio. The name Jonathan Hale appeared twice, once in a casualty report, marked as wounded, and again in a field hospital record, dated June 14, 1944, listing him as missing after reconnaissance assignment. There were no death certificates, no gravesite, just a record of disappearance. A man who had gone into the smoke of war and never come back out. He reached out to the National Double-Waste Museum in New Orleans and then to the Military Records Office in St. Louis, where a staff archivist named Sarah Hastings confirmed that many documents from Hale's battalion had been lost in a 1973 fire. "We know he existed," she told Michael over the phone. "But that's about it. No letters, no next of kin listed, just that he vanished." But Michael didn't stop there. He remembered something his grandmother used to say when he was young, always in passing, always soft. "There are some things the heart never forgets, even when the body does." It came back to him now like a whisper. He turned to the family photo albums, dusty and worn, stored in plastic tubs in the garage. There, tucked between a church group picnic and a Thanksgiving dinner from 1963, he found it. A black and white photo, slightly curled at the edges, showing a young woman in a nurse's uniform, Margaret, standing beside a tall man in military fatigues. They were smiling, squinting into the sun, standing in front of what appeared to be a stone wall, olive trees in the background. The back of the photo was marked faintly in pencil. "Margaret and Jonathan, Naples, 1944. His hands trembled as he held the photograph to the light. This wasn't just some romantic footnote. It was real. They had known each other. They had stood together in that moment, before the letter, before the silence, before the loss. Michael returned to Boston with a copy of the photo and the letter in hand. At the Boston Public Library, he met with Professor Ann Whitmore again. She examined the image, the letter, the inscription in the book. "It's rare," she said quietly, "to find something this complete, this human. Most stories like this are fragments. You have a thread." Michael nodded. "I think my grandfather knew. I think he found the letter. Or maybe my grandmother showed it to him." He paused. "And I think he kept it. For her." Professor Whitmore didn't respond right away, but she finally said, "Sometimes love doesn't end. It just changes form and waits for someone to notice." The days that followed felt suspended in a quiet fog, as if the world had slowed just enough to give Michael the space to trace shadows. He had classes to teach, emails to answer, errands to run, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the letter, the photograph, and that single unspoken name now echoing through the chambers of his family history. Jonathan Hale. It no longer felt like research. It felt like listening, and he was starting to realize that some silences were deliberate, built not from fear, but from reverence. One lead brought him to the American Battle Monuments Commission. There, he found confirmation that Lieutenant Jonathan Hale had no known grave, but his name was etched in marble at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery in Nettuno, Italy, one of the many listed as missing in action. That one inscription, his name carved in stone among thousands, hit Michael with unexpected force. He stared at it on his laptop screen for a long while, wondering who else had seen it, or if anyone had ever visited in Jonathan's memory. He reached out again to Sarah Hastings, the archivist in St. Louis, who this time dug deeper. She sent him a scanned field log, barely legible, recovered from a backup archive. In it, a brief entry dated June 13, 1944, noted that Lieutenant J. Hale had volunteered for a reconnaissance patrol outside Anzio. The mission was never completed. He never returned. No remains were recovered. Just one line added in red pencil. Presumed lost, unconfirmed. No ceremony, no last words, just absence. Haunted but determined, Michael shifted his focus to Providence, Rhode Island, his grandmother's hometown. She had lived there most of her young life, long before she moved to Boston and met Richard Davenport. He remembered fragments of family lore, that she had worked as a nurse during the war, had joined the Red Cross, and was stationed somewhere overseas, though details had always been vague. At the Providence City Archives, Michael requested personnel records of local Red Cross volunteers from the 1940s. The archivist, a woman named Ellie with a calm voice and patient manner, returned after an hour holding a thin, yellowing folder labeled Margaret A. Bishop, 1943-1946. Inside were scanned identification cards, deployment logs, and 2 photographs of young nurses in uniform. Margaret's smile was unmistakable, but what struck Michael most was a short, typewritten paragraph at the bottom of her deployment record, dated February 28, 1944. Assigned to Naples, Italy, Field Hospital Sector 3B, reported excellent service, frequently requested reassignment to forward stations. Known associate, Lieutenant Jonathan Hale, U.S. Army, 45th Infantry. The name, on paper, linked. Official. He left the archives walking slower than he arrived, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across Benefit Street. That simple sentence, the name of a man lost, tethered to his grandmother's name, felt heavier than any gravestone. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was real. They had worked together, known each other, loved, perhaps. And something had happened out there, something so powerful that she had never spoken of it again. Back in Boston, he found a contact through Professor Whitmore, an elderly woman named Eleanor James, a retired nurse who had served with Margaret in Naples. Her mind was still sharp, her voice soft but certain. They met in a quiet assisted living home near Jamaica Plain. "I remember your grandmother well," she said, sipping her tea with both hands wrapped around the cup. Smart, strong, quieter than most, but with eyes that carried too much for someone so young. She was the kind who listened when others were loud. Michael waited, letting the silence speak before asking, "Did she ever mention Jonathan Hale?" Eleanor looked out the window for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, once, just once." She paused. "He played violin, you know, made one out of wood scraps and an old cigar box. Not good, but sweet. Played for the boys at night." A faint smile flickered. She liked him, more than she let on. After he went missing, she was different. Not broken, just stiller. That word again. Still. "She never talked about it," Eleanor added. "Not even when we were older. I asked her once, maybe in the 60s. She just said, 'Some things belong to the silence, Elle. Not because they're painful, but because they were precious.'" Michael didn't respond. He couldn't. There was too much rising in his chest to let anything out. Later that evening, back at home, he opened a notebook that had belonged to his grandfather. In it were quotes, sketches, sermon notes from his days as a Sunday school teacher, and on the last page, a line handwritten in fading ink, "You don't compete with ghosts, you honor them." Dated October 1982, the year Michael was born. The truth was no longer hidden. It had always been waiting, and it had been honored, not buried. It was nearly midnight when Michael sat down at the dining room table, the letter unfolded in front of him once again, lit only by the amber glow of the hanging chandelier that had once belonged to his grandmother. The house was quiet. the kind of quiet that feels earned, not accidental. And he found himself reading not just the words on the page, but the spaces between them. He already knew what the letter said. He could have recited it from memory. But tonight, he read it differently. Not as a grandson trying to solve a family mystery, not even as a man seeking historical clarity, but as someone finally willing to feel what had been left behind. My dearest Margaret, if this letter finds you, it likely means I'm not coming back. Yes, it opened with a finality that no young man in war should ever have to write, and yet Jonathan Hale's voice, careful, precise, deeply human, carried no bitterness, only tenderness. I've seen enough to know that not all of us get to finish what we start, but if I'm not there to say goodbye, let this be my goodbye and my thank you. He wrote about their days in Naples, about her kindness in the field hospital, about the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear when she thought no one was looking, about a walk they had taken along the cliffs where he'd told her about Vermont and violins, and she had laughed quietly but didn't let go of his hand. Toward the end of the letter, his words shifted from memory to release. I want you to live a good life, Margaret. Don't mourn too long. Don't let guilt follow you. If there's someone who gives you peace, let them in. Don't close the door on happiness for my sake. I'll be gone, but you'll still be here. You deserve the years I didn't get. Michael folded the letter slowly, gently, as if it might crumble under the weight of its own honesty. It wasn't just a farewell. It was permission, a gift, an act of love so quiet, so complete, that it had waited over half a century to be understood. And for the first time, he thought of his grandfather not as the outsider in this story, but as the man who had accepted it, who had known, or at least sensed, that Margaret's heart had once belonged to someone who never returned. Maybe she had shown him the letter. Maybe he had found it. Maybe she never had to explain, because he never asked. Later that week, while helping his mother sort through her garage, Michael found a faded envelope in the back of an old jewelry box that had once belonged to Margaret. It was sealed, no address, no stamp. On the back, written in her careful cursive, "Do not return to sender." He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a second letter, one she had written but never sent. Jonathan, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to believe that somewhere, somehow, you will know I didn't forget. I couldn't. She spoke of her life after the war, of marrying Richard, of building a family, of loving him deeply. But she also confessed to carrying Jonathan with her always. Not in betrayal, not in comparison, just beside me, in the quiet. And then the final lines. I will live as you asked, but I will never stop hearing your voice in the leaves or in the silence just before sleep. Thank you for teaching me what love looks like, even when it doesn't last. Michael didn't cry, not immediately. Instead, he walked out onto the porch, the sky above him wide and heavy with stars, and stood in stillness for a long time. The truth wasn't tragic. It wasn't bitter. It was beautiful. Two people had found each other briefly, intensely, and then had lost one another to war. But the love hadn't vanished. It had simply been folded away, preserved. He thought of how his grandparents had lived, quietly, respectfully, never dramatic, always steady. He remembered how his grandfather had once said, "Your grandmother never needed much, just peace. That was always enough for her." And now he knew why. In a notebook Richard had kept, filled with Bible verses, quotes, and newspaper clippings, Michael found a passage taped to the inside cover. A simple sentence from Thoreau, "There is no remedy for love but to love more." It wasn't signed, but Michael understood. Richard had loved Margaret not in competition, but in harmony, accepting the ghost that walked beside her. And that perhaps was the real story, not of a letter that never reached its destination, but of a woman who never let it go, of a man who made space for it, and of a grandson who finally opened the page. Spring returned to Boston with the usual hesitancy, one day warm, the next day stubbornly grey, and yet, within the uneven rhythm of the season, Michael felt a strange kind of peace settle into his bones, the kind of peace not born from answers, but from understanding, the kind that doesn't end in exclamation marks, but in quiet nods. He hadn't expected to be changed by a letter, and yet here he was, sitting in the same room where he'd first unfolded those fragile pages, no longer the same man. The letter had never been delivered, at least not in the way Jonathan Hale had intended. But in the end, it had reached the person who needed it most, Margaret. And she had answered it not with a reply, but with a life that honored both love and silence, a life built not on denial, but on a quiet form of remembrance. And now, Michael felt the weight and the privilege of carrying that remembrance forward. He began to write, not with the intention of publishing, not at first. It started as a journal, just a place to hold the pieces. The letter, the photo, the names, the absence. Then came the dates, the records, the quotes from his grandfather's notebook. Slowly, it began to form a shape, not just a story about two people in wartime, but about what it means to carry love and not speak of it, what it means to know loss and still choose joy, what it means to inherit something invisible and make it real. When he finally decided to share the story, he titled it simply, "The Letter in the Book." It appeared first as an essay on a small literary blog, then it was picked up by a veterans magazine, then by a historical society newsletter. Within a month, the inbox was flooded, not with opinions, but with echoes. Letters from readers who had lost someone, notes from children of veterans, messages from strangers who had found similar artifacts and never known what to do with them. People across the country began to write back. One woman in Ohio sent a scan of a photograph, her grandmother and a man named Will smiling on a pier in 1942. Will never came home. The photo had sat in a shoebox for 70 years. Another man from San Diego shared a bundle of letters his great-uncle had sent from Okinawa, letters never opened until now. A retired teacher from Maine wrote, "I thought I was the only one carrying someone else's silence, but maybe we all are." It was then that Michael realized this story was never just about his grandparents. It was part of something much larger, a quiet inheritance passed from generation to generation, made not of medals or houses or money, but of memory, of permission, of forgiveness, of resilience. Soon after, he was invited to speak at the Massachusetts State Library. The event was modest, attended by veterans, students, and a few elderly couples who brought their own envelopes, hoping he might help them understand what they had found. Michael didn't give a lecture. He just read the letter, word for word, no commentary. And when he finished, there was no applause, only silence, a good silence, the kind that doesn't ask for more. In the months that followed, Michael created a small online archive called Voices Never Sent, a space for people to submit the lost letters of their families. It grew slowly, but steadily. Each entry was treated with care, with dignity. No dramatization, just presence. But there was one more thing he had to do. On a warm day in June, Michael traveled to Providence, to the cemetery where his grandparents were buried side by side under a maple tree that had grown tall and wide since his childhood. He came alone, carrying a small hand-bound booklet containing both Jonathan's letter and Margaret's reply. Inside, he had also placed a copy of the photograph from Naples and a single daisy, dried, preserved, delicate. He knelt beside the gravestone and placed the booklet beneath the soil, wrapped in cloth and string, not to hide it, not to bury it, but to return it, not to silence, but to stillness. There were no words spoken, only a breath, a pause, a hand resting on cool stone. He stood and looked at the names carved in granite. Richard and Margaret Davenport, husband and wife, years etched beneath. And beside them, for just a moment, Michael imagined another name. One not carved, but carried. Jonathan Hale. Not erased, not forgotten, just part of the story now. And as he walked back toward his car, The wind moving through the grass in soft, ribbon-like waves, Michael thought about the last line from his grandmother's letter, the one that still echoed. "I will live as you asked, but I will never stop hearing your voice in the leaves or in the silence just before sleep. Some legacies speak, others whisper. This one remained, quiet, but not lost." By the end of that summer, the days had grown slower, quieter, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but sacred. Michael sat in the same study where it all began, sunlight pouring in through the sheer white curtains, the book resting on the table as if it had never moved. So much had changed, and yet the room remained the same. The wood still creaked beneath his chair. The books still lined the walls, dusted but familiar, and the letter, though carefully archived now, still lived in his memory with the same gravity as the first moment he opened it. He had told the story. He had honored the silence. And now he was letting it rest. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but placed gently back into the stream of time where it belonged. Not to be solved, not to be broadcast, not to be repackaged, but simply to be remembered for what it was, a love that lived, a grief that endured, a man who disappeared, a woman who didn't, and the quiet, honorable man who stood beside her, knowing it all, needing no explanation, offering only presence. Before closing the final pages of his handwritten manuscript, the small book he decided to title "Between the Lines and the Silence," Michael wrote one last sentence. It wasn't meant to be profound. It was just true. Some love stories don't end with war. They just wait quietly between the pages until someone is ready to read them. He included a scanned copy of the original letter, the photo from Naples, and a reproduction of the book's dedication. "To Margaret, who taught me that war may wound the body but not the soul." He didn't add commentary. He didn't try to interpret. He let the letter speak for itself, the way Jonathan had written it, the way Margaret had kept it. And when the book was printed, only 50 copies bound by hand and given to family and a few close readers, he left one copy on the marble headstone at the cemetery in Providence. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a daisy, a ribbon, and a folded page. The wind moved gently through the grass, and Michael stood for a moment longer, knowing there was nothing more to say. Because some truths don't need to be spoken. Some truths just need to be held. We share new stories every day, true stories that move and inspire.